good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Abby Lester. I am the director of the JDC Global Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture by Dynner, which is made possible by the generous support of Miriam, Mimi, Pasternak, Toubin, public educational programming from the JDC Archives. Today's program is also part of a JDC Archives webinar series on exploring the Jewish experience in Poland from World War I to the Holocaust, insights from the JDC Archives. So first, a few words about the archives. We hold the organizational history of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, JDC, or the Joint, including millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as audio, video, and film recordings dating back to the founding of the organization in 1914. Operating out of both the New York and Jerusalem offices, one of our roles is to make JDC's history available to researchers, historians, genealogists, among others. Given the role the organization has played in Jewish lives around the world since 1914, our archives reflect not only the history of the organization, but also the history of world Jewry in the 20th and 21st centuries. In fact, we're regarded as one of the most important archives for the study of modern Jewish history. Visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, curators, filmmakers. To support scholarly research in our collection, we also offer fellowships funded by generous donors. Our speaker today, Dynner, is the Carl and Dorothy Bennett Professor of Judaic Studies and Director of the Bennett Center at Fairfield University. He is the editor of the journal Shofar, an interdisciplinary journal of Jewish studies, and a recent Guggenheim Fellow. He's the author of Men of Silk, The Hasidic Conquest of Polish Jewish Society, published by Oxford University Press in 2006, and Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor, and Life in the Kingdom of Poland, also Oxford University Press in 2014. And his new book is entitled The Light of Learning, Hasidism in Poland on the Eve of the Holocaust, also Oxford University Press, 2024. In addition, he was the recipient of a 2016 Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship. The format today, Professor Dynner will present for 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are turned off, and we'll be taking questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the program, and Dynner will now start his lecture.
Thanks so much, Abby, and thanks to Isabel for helping to organize this. I'd really like to thank also the JDC. I was a recipient, as you heard, of the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Fellowship a few years ago. That formed the basis of a lot of my research, both for my recent book, Light of Learning, and also the current book project, which I'm just beginning really now, and I'm going to share a lot of my preliminary thoughts with you. So we'll be working sort of between the last book and towards the next mountain that I'm climbing, which is going to be hopefully a book on something that I think we've all been thinking a lot about, and that is anti-Jewish violence, in this case in Poland, and also different varying Jewish responses to violence. I would really like to start with one of the most difficult and perhaps obvious questions, and that is, how should one respond to anti-Jewish violence? How should Jews respond to this? How perhaps should any stateless minority group or diaspora group respond to collective assaults on their community? I mean, it's a very difficult thing to respond to because you're in the minority. Anything you do is going to be met with a great deal of resentment on the part of the majority or dominant population. So that's our first dilemma. We can't really compare the situation today to the situation in Poland because today there is a Jewish state, a polity, which in theory can actually intervene and perhaps put pressure on governments of various countries. This is a situation that's quite different from the one that I'm going to be addressing today, which is the pre-World War II situation, the pre-State of Israel situation, where Jews really are a physically vulnerable minority, and they're faced with unprecedented degrees of anti-Jewish violence. And so it makes for a very, I would say, intriguing kind of study, the study of responses to violence. That's not the most interesting question for me, though, even though it's a practical one. The most interesting question that arose from all of this is probably broader and more historiographical, and that is, what does violence in Jewish history really mean? Typically, the beginnings of Jewish historiography, historians would treat Jews like a vulnerable, defenseless victim group and would focus on violence in that same way as something that was kind of inexorable, inevitable. Jews were presented as a kind of helpless victim group, and that really began to change as a result of the work of historians like Salo Baron, who felt that this kind of victimization chain was really robbing us of a much richer and, say, active historiography in which Jews really were agents, and they managed to obtain power at various periods of time. But I'd like to progress really to the next level, and in this, I'm influenced by recent works on Native American history and the history of violence against other vulnerable groups, in this case, Ned Blackhawk, who came up with this concept of formative violence. And what he argues is that Native Americans in this country, in the United States, which is where I'm coming from right now, um, that Native Americans were not only destroyed by violence, but they were actually formed by violence, and their creative responses are really, really interesting and sometimes inspiring. In other words, we focus on not only modes of survival, but actually modes of adjustment and formation. So the question I would like to put, the even larger question I would put at the beginning of this talk is, how can we say, um, does violence shape a stateless diaspora community not only through destruction, but also by compelling a community towards creative responses and formations? In our case, we're going to look at political formations, but also cultural, intellectual, and religious formations, all of which, in my opinion, makes Polish Jewish history much more bracing, much more interesting and inspiring. Because given what you have, you can respond passively, you can respond helplessly, or you can search out modes of empowerment, modes of resistance, modes of creative institution building, and so on. So that's what I'd really like to discuss today. We're going to begin actually in the Second Republic of Poland. Poland had been wiped off the map, had been dominated by its neighbors for over a century. Before World War I, Russia, Prussia, and Austria had partitioned Poland, and now for the first time in the wake of World War I, we have a new independent Poland. And that's great news for Polish society. But if you look at this map, which is an ethnic map, ethno-linguistic map of Poland, you'll see that Poles were only barely a majority of this new state. You look at the gold and the green parts, and you have large minorities of Ukrainians and Belarusians. And we haven't even addressed yet the Jewish minority, which is extremely urban. Jews tend to live in towns and cities. In towns, especially as you go eastward, they form a majority, sometimes 80, 90% of towns. So they're a very, very kind of standout ethno-religious minority within a state that's already multi-ethnic, multi-religious, if you count different denominations of Christianity, multi-linguistic. And I would say it makes Poland a rather insecure state. On the one hand, Poland wants to be inclusive, feels like it has to be inclusive, but there are many ethno-nationalist elements that really are uncomfortable with these large minorities, including Jews, and want to really reduce their influence, assimilate them, or if that's not possible, even expel them. And Jews are going to be subjected to these pressures a lot. Same time, there's a tremendous degree of religious freedom for Jews. And you will see, if you look at the arrows on the margins here of my slides, you'll see Jews, especially traditionalist Jews, Hasidic and other Orthodox Jews, are actually fleeing the Soviet Union and later Germany and Austria for the relative religious freedom of Poland. So we have a paradox. We have a Poland that provides great religious freedom to Jews. It does not actually offer the same religious freedoms to Ukrainians. Their churches are sometimes destroyed or converted into Catholic churches. So Jews really have a unique religious freedom here, but they're also seen as too powerful, too influential economically. It's seen as an embarrassing situation. Poles, meaning Polish Catholics, if they are to feel truly independent and truly liberated, they feel they also need to take charge of their own economic fate. And that means pushing Jews out of economic niches in various ways, sometimes through boycotts, violence, pogroms, as we're going to see. And that's really going to be the tragedy, because that's going to be the cause of a lot of anti-Jewish violence throughout this short, brief history of Polish independence between the two world wars. It's a shame because it's a lost opportunity. Jews could have been incorporated into Poland, and there were efforts to do so by leaders like Józef Pilsudski, but the efforts were always kind of ambivalent. And they were accompanied by all kinds of restrictive measures, sometimes outright, official discrimination against Jews in order to so-called Polonize the economy. And so Jews respond to the situation of a kind of impossible integration by forming their own subcultures. Some, especially youths, become revolutionaries, socialists, Marxists, communists even. The most popular party is the Bund, which is a form of Jewish socialism. It takes place in Yiddish. Zionism, the desire to create an independent Jewish polity, preferably in Palestine, but for Jews living in Poland still, there's also an effort to fight for Jewish rights. And Hasidism and other forms of orthodoxy, which become parts of which become politicized in this period, especially in the party Agudat Yisrael, known as the Aguda. Now, each of these subcultures is going to respond differently to anti-Jewish violence. Bundists, for example, are going to respond perhaps the most effectively because they form self-defense units to fight against pogroms and other forms of anti-Jewish violence. They will organize protests, demonstrations, and strikes against anti-Jewish violence, but they'll do so in coordination with non-Jewish groups, especially the Polish Socialist Party, the PPS. Zionists are also very active in political and physical self-defense, but they can be a little trigger happy, so we're going to find, and they can actually sometimes instigate more violence. They are much less effective in terms of coordinate their efforts with members of the dominant culture, the way the Bundists are. And then we have Hasidic and Orthodox Jews who, through Agudat Israel and other parties, do fight anti-Jewish violence in their own way, which is usually the more traditional way of lobbying, so-called shtadlanut. This can be extremely effective. They raise it to a new level by actively taking part in the political process in the Polish parliament or the Sejm, as do other groups, but their method in the same is often more effective because they tend to be more collaborative, cooperative, maybe pliable, and they're most of all concerned with safeguarding their educational institutions. When it does come to the pogroms after the death of Pilsudski in 1935, though, they really step up their lobbying and their political activities, and they really do become quite effective, and they're flexible enough to join efforts with the Bund in certain cases, such as demonstrations and protests. Now, in my recent book, The Light of Learning, I really focus on this group, Hasidic Jews in Poland, because I felt like they were neglected. Historians have really addressed the Zionists and the socialists, and to a lesser extent, communists, but they hadn't really conceived of Hasidic and Orthodox Jews as people with agency, people who were activists, people who would actively fight for their rights, who would resist, who had inner lives and aspirations of their own, some of them quite modern, believe it or not. And that was the story that I tried to tell in my book. But in this talk, we're gonna address them, but we're gonna also go beyond them in addressing responses to anti-Jewish violence. The joint, or the JDC, is conceived during World War I, largely as an emergency effort, first in Palestine and then in Eastern Europe, providing basic needs, but eventually also providing educational needs, cultural needs, through their Central Relief Committee. And this was spearheaded by the Orthodox, so it really did take on a very traditionalist kind of aspect. Jewish parents, according to an immediate post-war kind of Monday morning quarterbacking appeal, who had always sacrificed their last penny in order to give their children a Jewish education, did not altogether change their traditional habits, even during these most stressful years. Local committees were formed in all the Jewish communities, and many hungry and naked Jewish parent cheerfully handed back part of his meager relief dole to this committee, the Central Relief Committee, as a contribution towards his child's education. Jewish mothers clamored, "Give us schools for our growing boys, and never mind the bread or the clothes." Jewish parents starved themselves in order to give their children the rudiments of an education in things Jewish. So, one of the most important things to arise out of the violence of World War I was not merely physical destruction, not merely the destruction of all kinds of cultural and religious institutions, but an urgency, the creation of philanthropic organizations that in the post-war period are actually going to become a mainstay of cultural and educational support. So it's sort of like if life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. In this case, they make schools, schools that are improved, refurbished, and sometimes created whole cloth in the ashes or out of the ashes of World War I. We have especially religious schools emerging because there was an attitude among the Central Relief Committee and its the leaders like Cyrus Adler, that they didn't want to actually socially engineer or transform Polish Jewish culture, but rather work with what they thought was the main cultural aspiration of various groups. And they saw that aspiration as being still largely traditionalist, although they did give to other schools as well. And if you look at this pie chart, you will see 55% of JDC money in the wake of the war going to so-called Torah institutions. That means the Cheder, the traditionalist Jewish elementary school, Beis Yaakov schools for girls and women, traditionalist girls and women, and yeshivas. And the number and type of yeshivas that are supported is going to fluctuate, but there are a lot of yeshivas being supported, both Hasidic and non-Hasidic. And the Yiddishist, mainly socialist schools, in contrast, receive only 25%, and Zionists and other nonpartisan groups receive even less, and they complain a lot throughout the years. I've seen this in the archives. But this really was an effort to be fair-minded on the part of Cyrus Adler and JDC leaders. They really did have this perception that 55% of Jewish school children and young adults really desired a traditionalist Jewish education. So that was really, I would say, a kind of a cultural map of what Polish Jewry looked like at the time, at least as far as the JDC could gather. One of the major results of this network of support arising out of the ashes of World War I is the rise of the Hasidic yeshiva. And it's important to note that Hasidism before World War I, although it had its scholars, for sure, some of them quite prominent, really had a reputation for singing and dancing and emotional worship and emotional, mystical forms of Yiddishkeit, Judaism. And in the wake of World War I, we go from only a couple of Hasidic yeshivas, mainly Lubavitcher, to this explosion of Hasidic yeshivas amounting to over 150, and about 12 of them, about a dozen, are going to be world renowned. One of them, Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, which you see pictured to the right of your screen, is actually the most elite and famous Polish yeshiva of its day, and it's formed in the wake of World War I, and it is a Hasidic yeshiva, attracting international support and students from all over the world. It was an extremely difficult admission process, and this became a symbol of intellectual Hasidism. So this really is one of the most important results of the violence and the destruction of World War I, is this kind of creative response. Another very important response is what I mentioned before: 250 Beis Yaakov schools for Hasidic and Orthodox girls and women. And you can see how many existed on the map here. Again, as a result of the destruction of World War I. Now, a lot of this is the result of anxiety. Not only have our institutions of education and religious institutions been destroyed, according to Hasidic and Orthodox leaders, but the youth are becoming increasingly secularized and drawn into the Zionist and socialist and communist alternatives. So there is a sense of crisis going on here as well that we should be aware of. It's pushing them to reinvent. The effect on the movement, though, is a move from the Hasidic courts to yeshivas as the really central institutions that constitute the new elites and the new Hasidic identity. Now, if we move back to the economy and the causes of anti-Jewish violence, without blaming the victims, we can say that it was a pretty jarring occupational distribution in Poland. For those who are nationalistically minded and can't conceive of Jews as part of the Polish population. Because if you look at the pie chart on the left, Jews are really disproportionately involved in trade and crafts, whereas the general population, mainly Catholic Poles, are still largely involved in agriculture as late as 1931. And if we break it down a different way, Jews are accounting still for almost half of the population engaged in trade and crafts and manufacturing. That means urban pursuits, whereas the general population is largely still involved in agricultural pursuits. Right? So For peasants who are also receiving a Polish education for the first time, at least at the elementary school level, there is now universal public school education in Poland. They really have a desire to move off of their family plots, which are getting smaller and smaller as time goes on, and to break in to urban pursuits, to have stores and stalls and run taverns and perhaps get involved with crafts. And they find it very difficult to break in. So there's going to be a real resentment on the part of young peasants who just find that it's very, very difficult to make that kind of transition to urban pursuits because Jews have been doing this for centuries. They have centuries old, sometimes centuries old relationships with the older peasant generation. It's a kind of a symbiosis that exists, and it leads to a lot of frustration. And they are really, really, I would say, ripe for intolerant, ethno nationalist, right wing Polish movements. And those movements are making promises, which, according to one document I found in the JDC archives, to the effect that the current regime will collapse, a nationalist regime is coming. The new regime will expel Jews from Poland. There will be no more unemployment, and Polish workers will at last find work. And here's a march on the right-hand side, which says, carrying a banner that says work and bread for Poles, by which they mean Catholic Poles. So there is this kind of promise going around in the form of handbills and speeches at gatherings by groups like Stronnictwo Narodowe, which is the larger kind of right-wing nationalist, ethno-nationalist movement, and Obóz Narodowy Radykalny, the ONR, which is really a more violent youth group that's an offshoot that is even more dangerous, and they will become active in fomenting pogroms. All as a result, really, of the frustration, the sense that Jews are still a foreign element that's dominating the Polish economy, and the freedom and independence that Poland achieved in the wake of World War I is incomplete, right? As long as Jews are really, quote unquote, controlling the economy. And that's really the perception. It's going to extend to the professions as well. The joint had representatives that were engaged in interviews with local peasants. And here's one really interesting one that I found. The people are being fooled, this one respondent says. They are told that soon they will be in power. The government will be changed. So he's skeptical. And the question is asked, are the peasants not afraid of the police? The agitators said it didn't matter. They told us that the heads for the army, the militia, and the government were with us. We were told that we would not meet with resistance, meaning if they overthrew the current government and pushed Jews out of the economy and out of Poland. Do the peasants believe everything they're told? Some believe and some don't. But those that do not believe can't do very much because they are attacked at night and their property destroyed if they dare to oppose the movement. So you begin to see that there's a lot of compulsion going on, a lot of pressure on Polish peasants to join in this right-wing nationalist movement. And those who buy from Jews are also going to see their products being confiscated and destroyed. And it becomes very, very difficult. So, in other words, there's an immense kind of social pressure that is taking a very anti Jewish form, that even peasants like this who don't buy into it are feeling like they have no choice but to kind of give into it. Right-wing publications like Kalendarz Samoobrony, which means the calendar of self-defense, which is how they're conceiving anti-Semitism in the wake of 1935, which is after Pilsudski's death, where things really, really got more intensively anti-Jewish. They have a very interesting cover in which there's a boot that's kicking out this very traditionalist-looking Jew, probably a Hasid, and the sign says, "To Palestine," meaning Jews go back to Palestine. That's a very interesting thing to see in the current context. And it affected the universities, it affected college campuses. I hope this isn't too triggering for anybody um, who has kids on college campuses right now, but they were much worse in Poland. Jewish students in Polish universities were being attacked, assaulted by roving bands of right-wing nationalists, and really being physically attacked and assaulted. And you see the number of Jews going way down in terms of attendance, enrollments, the number of non-Jews going up. And there are even demonstrations against Jews. Banner says "A Day Without Jews," and really wanting to recreate the ghetto through ghetto benches. And you'll see in the classrooms, and you'll see also, this is just one town from the JDC archives, yet Vabna, an infamous town later on, there are economic boycotts against Jews that are really affecting the numbers of Jewish-owned shops as well as Jewish-owned market stalls. They're all going down. And so there are boycotts really not just against Jews, but against the peasants, as I mentioned, and peasants who still try to buy from Jews. Christians still try to buy from Jews are being beaten up. Their their purchases are destroyed. Oops, I'm sorry. Let's go back to this. And this boycott situation is going to lead rather quickly into pogroms beginning in 1935, which are not as lethal as pogroms happening in Ukrainian territories during the First World War or in Polish territories during the First World War. In this case, the death toll is relatively speaking low, but remember that Poland had been considered a kind of refuge for Jewish life, sandwiched as it was between the Soviet Union, which repressed Jewish religious expression, and of course, Nazi Germany, which repressed Jewish existence altogether. So this was a real shock to the Polish Jewish communities. In just one county, according to archives that I've turned up, you see that March was a terrible month in 1936, with beatings and broken windows and terror against Jews, but also terror against Christians, as I mentioned. Jews sent delegations in the case of Pshitik, which was going to be the scene of a major pogrom, and they try to make the argument that this is not just against Jews. Christian peasants are being targeted and terrorized, and suppressing these anti-Jewish actions are in the interest of everyone and for the good of the state. So they try to make a universalistic argument. When the Pshitik pogrom happens, it's triggered by the killing of a peasant who had been part of a rampage against the Jewish community, but it just sort of like, Zionist youth had escalated things and used pistols, and that enraged the mob, and they go into the Jewish neighborhoods and murder this Minkowski couple, completely innocent, and it was a real shock. And it took on international significance because at the trial, the Jewish self-defense members who were caught were actually given the heaviest sentences, and the pogrom perpetrators, the Poles, even those who had been seen committing murder, were actually acquitted. So it was really an incident that took on international proportions. And to make matters worse, this one document I found in the archives, police were actually told after this pogrom that they shouldn't make arrests anymore during fairs and markets and similar population gatherings when there's a suspicion that the arrested person has a number of supporters in the crowd who will come to his aid. In other words, they're giving in to the mob violence. And so there are a series of pogroms. These are the most infamous: Minsk, Mazowiecki. Notice that Jewish stores and stalls are destroyed, and in their place, Christian stalls are being created or set up. So the pogroms become an instrument for actually economic displacement. Here's Life magazine did a whole story on it. This is some of the photographs they took, of the terror that's going on. So this is reaching the American reading public. And Brest, or Brest, also becomes a scene of an infamous pogrom. And again, Jewish stalls and stores are destroyed and replaced by Polish ones. So it really is an economic-based pogrom. Now, the Bund is going to respond to these pogroms with organized physical self-defense that's well coordinated with the Polish socialist, non-Jewish socialist movement, although there are Jews involved in that as well. Our people were under a strict prohibition against using guns unless ordered to do so. We didn't want it to appear, however, that this was a battle between Poles and Jews, but rather between fascists and anti-fascists. So this was really an attempt, and I would say the most effective attempt, to get Poles of goodwill, of universalistic mentality, to join in the defense of the Jewish communities. And they were often successful in doing so. And they would organize protest rallies, which other Jewish parties would actually join in, and Christians would join in, especially socialists, well, not always Christians, but socialist Poles would join in as well. The effective response of Hasidic and Orthodox Jews was much more symbolic and behind the scenes. After Bresh, Hillel Seidman argues the recent brutality must not silence Torah study. Establishing a new yeshiva would be the ultimate refutation of the reigning barbarity. And this is largely symbolic, but actually another example of this creative response to violence. What do you do if your community is attacked? You build a yeshiva so that we can reassert our spiritual intellectual pursuits. And so here you really see that Torah study takes on a political meaning in addition to its more traditional meanings. And this one Hasidic Rebbe, Friedman, the Sadagora Rebbe, argues that for a massive educational effort in non-Jewish homes, in which the Aguda would become a world center for Jewish resistance, its activists must agitate and enlighten rather than merely wait for another attack by the enemies of the Jews. And he argues quite practically that education might not stop the anti-Jewish agitation, but it would make it more difficult. So try to get allies among the non-Jews in their own way. Perhaps the most effective Hasidic response is behind-the-scenes intercession. Here's a meeting with a general whom the Bobov Rebbe had actually grown up with, who knew from his hometown Bobov, which is where this general came from. And there were some very effective intercessions in the Polish parliament, or Sejm, that attempted to get the police to actually do their job, protect the Jewish communities, and also to resist the anti-kosher slaughtering decrees, shechita decrees, that were so threatening to the traditional Jewish way of life, were seen as humane, but were actually aimed at hurting Jewish butchers who had really a large portion of the meat trade. Another interesting response of Hasidic leaders was to soften their opposition to Zionism, arguing even if Jewish political sovereignty in Palestine will not mark the beginning of the redemption, it will at least mark the beginning of redemption from troubles and save numerous Jewish lives in the process. And the Aguda manages to procure a large number of certificates for Hasidic and Orthodox youth to actually emigrate to the land of Israel during these years, 1939, where things do seem to be getting very dangerous. Now, what did the Joint Distribution Committee do? They respond in a good American fashion with capitalism, meaning retraining locals to engage in pursuits that are seen as perhaps less offensive to Polish sensibilities, get them out of trade and more into crafts and become artisans, sometimes producing even Polish Jewish handicrafts that they can sell to American Jews as kind of representing an authentic Polish Jewish craft or folk expression, like plates and other kinds of wares that are seen rather nostalgically by the American consumers. So all kinds of creative ways to make Polish Jews economically productive and able to rebuild economically in ways that aren't going to somehow offend the sensibilities of the Polish majority. It was not always successful, but it was an attempt. And Bernard Kahn, who's the European director, urges everybody to make as little propaganda as possible about the work we do for Poland and about the funds we send there. Anti Semitic propaganda is so rampant that too much publicity may do a great deal of harm. So really, to keep the aid and sometimes just outright economic aid of cows and sewing machines that they would give to these pogromized Jewish communities, keep it really under the wraps. Don't publicize it too much. Now, when the Holocaust begins, the Joint plays a very important part in monitoring what's going on and trying to figure out, really what is happening as soon as the Nazi invasion ensues. They talk about the rapid advance of German troops in Poland, which has cut off Jews in the Polish corridor and so on in various towns. And they're really fearing for what's going to happen when the Germans take over towns further eastward, which are much more predominantly majority Jewish. They really fear for the worst because of what they've seen by Nazi propaganda. Their role is as monitors mainly, but they begin also sending clothing and food and financial aid and even negotiating with Nazis to try to allow funds to get into the ghettos once they begin. And they really do become a crucial, if meager, form of support, even after the doors have been virtually slammed shut, although America's entry into the war really makes these efforts almost impossible at certain points. But for the first couple of years, they're crucial. They also are very instrumental in rescuing yeshiva students and moving them into what is still neutral Vilnius. Why yeshiva students? The Joint becomes convinced, persuaded that the Talmudic studies of the Polish yeshivas really represent a uniquely Jewish contribution to culture, and that causes them to prioritize yeshiva students, rabbis, their daughters and wives, over even Jews who are well educated in a secular sense, writers, artists, lawyers, doctors, engineers, because unfortunately, they have to really make difficult decisions, and they decide that this unique yeshiva culture needs to somehow be salvaged. So they really facilitate the supports and transport of yeshiva students into what is neutral Vilnius, and then on to Shanghai and Palestine and America once it's possible to do so. They're also providing a lot of actual tangible aid like food, soup kitchens, as you can see from this photograph. What happens to the yeshivas? They're occupied by the Nazis. In this case, we have yeshiva students supposedly resisting and shooting at German soldiers. And we don't know how to verify this, but this is according to the eyewitness account or testimony of a Nazi that they were shot at by by yeshiva students. Interesting enough, but this was not a mainstream Jewish response to the violence, mainstream Hasidic response. The more, I would say, prevalent and interesting response, which I've found, is the creation of yeshiva bunkers, where Hasidic and Orthodox youth would sit and study underground all day long while people would bring them food. This is one case of Warsaw that was documented. 700 lunches were being provided, so that gives you a sense. At one point, there were around probably 700 students studying the Talmud full time as a kind of, I would say, resistance and repudiation of this Western civilization that had proven to be so violent and barbaric. And I've uncovered yeshiva bunkers in, not I alone, but other scholars as well have uncovered yeshiva bunkers in several towns and cities. So it really is, I would say, an inspiring, if not effective, tangible and practical sense, an inspiring kind of reaction to Nazi genocidal violence. According to one account, Beis Yaakov schools as well were formed in these underground, or in this case, attic bunkers. Hungry, cold, destitute, working without textbooks, the teachers and children drew strength from each other. We would speak to the girls' souls and hearts more to their minds. We would climb a ladder up one flight, and although this climb was a little frightening, once upstairs, after we had pulled the ladder up after us, we felt as though we were in an enchanted, protected world where no one could reach us. We were like queens, free and distant from the terrible reality of the ghetto. I mean, in a sense, this is crucial for survival because it is so inspiring and so resistant to the demoralizing effects of living in the ghettos. The most famous and symbolic resistance is, of course, the physical resistance occurred in events like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and this is very well known. But tactically speaking, it doesn't have such a great effect, a great impact on the Nazi war effort. It has a much more important symbolic effect. This is something that we remember, that inspires us, that shows us that Jews were active agents and creative in trying to survive and maintain their humanity. And I think this aspect is the most important aspect of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, just as yeshiva bunkers were a crucial way of maintaining morale and a sense of cultural survival, so too was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, symbolic and culturally inspiring. And I think that's what we should take away from it, as well as the sheer physical accomplishments of having managed to drive the Germans away for a couple of months and take a few German casualties. So I would really end this talk by addressing this kind of symbolic cultural result, even of the Holocaust, which really has inspired the post-Holocaust rebuilding of Jewish communities in ways which we're, I think, only beginning to understand. Now, in the wake of the Holocaust, the joint is crucial in the displaced persons camps in terms of training Jews for agriculture and other kinds of occupations. And they facilitate the migration to Palestine and other centers as well. So they become really, really instrumental to what becomes a massive kind of redistribution of the Jewish population into new centers like America and what becomes the state of Israel. And with that, I'll stop and happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Glenn. That was really fascinating. Um, I appreciate all of the information you shared about the research that you've done. It was really very interesting. So let's take a look at some of the questions that have come through. There were quite a bit already. Okay, let's start here. According to Bernard Wasserstein's On the Eve, Orthodox Judaism was decreasing in numbers. Do you agree with that? And part two of that is, did Orthodox institutions receive a greater share of JDC funding because they lobbied for it?
Okay, the answer to both questions is yes, but I think it's more complicated than that. What I see is the Orthodox, Hasidic and Orthodox communities contracting, but also really intensifying. And historians have missed that crucial aspect. Yes, they become smaller quantitatively, but they really do reinvent themselves, and sometimes in quite modern ways. And I'm not the only one who's noticed this, but I'm one of the first to kind of monitor the effects through education and scholarship, which is really the mainstay of Hasidic and Orthodox culture. So the creation of yeshivas and Beis Yaakov schools being one prominent example. So it's a little bit deceptive to say that it grew smaller, right? Because, yeah, of course it grows smaller, but also really revitalizes in a way that I think historians have missed. Now, if we're gonna talk about the seeming preference the JDC has for these traditionalist communities, we are seeing the effects of lobbying for sure. It has to be recalled that the JDC was formed at its core by a prior smaller Orthodox, committee that I mentioned in the very beginning, that then is kind of joined and expanded upon with these more secular or neutral organizations. So, with Orthodoxy at its core during this formation, the Orthodox leaders are very, very well placed to lobby. And they make the argument quite effectively that, look, do you really want to change who Polish Jews are? That's not really our job here. Our job is simply to serve and to be a resource. And in that respect, we have to respect the cultural preferences of this population. And how much of that was accurate or not accurate, we don't really know for sure, but it seems like that was pretty accurate based on what I've been able to find in my own research.
So it's interesting that you say that there's some conflict with what you've said in the past. We have another comment that this individual found in the JDC archives that many in the JDC headquarters were upset the yeshiva students in Shanghai at the end of the war got double support from JDC and Bahatzala, and in comparison to the other needy Jewish refugees. Do you have any comments on that?
I see this throughout the interwar period and into the Holocaust, that there are all kinds of claims, that Adler and others are showing a preference. And Adler is adamant that he's being neutral, but he's just trying to avoid social engineering, that this is really what the majority of Polish Jews seem to want. And he's only trying to honor what they want, but he becomes very frustrated and disillusioned because, I don't think a lot of people believe him. Within the JDC itself, one of the things I've noticed they get very annoyed about is Yeshivat Chochmei Lublin in the interwar period, which they see as extravagant. It's meant to be this yeshiva that's also going to have dormitories and all kinds of comforts, uh, a cafeteria, and they think it's just unnecessary. And you're neglecting secular Polish Jewish proclivities. And I think that's probably right. I think that probably was happening, especially Tarbut schools. And they're the loudest in complaining because Tarbut represents Hebraist, but really Zionist education. And I believe, although I've never seen evidence of this, I believe that the JDC had the attitude like, why would we give to Zionists in Poland when we can use those resources in Palestine itself to help those communities? And, that just seemed like a better use of resources to them. But I haven't really been able to prove that yet. And somebody really should do a study about this.
Interesting. Um, I'm gonna jump to there's a question here. Uh, you portrayed Jews in Poland before World War II as better off than the Christian population. And the traditional view of Jews of Poland before World War II is that a majority were poor. Can you clarify? Also, was the fact that Jews were so much less involved in agriculture than Christian Poles attributed to whether they could own land?
So I want to be careful here because sometimes what I was quoting was the sentiments of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic writers who assume that Jews are all better off. In reality, there's mass poverty among the Jews of Poland, and it's only getting worse as a result, not just of anti-Jewish boycotts, but government, that means officially sponsored discrimination. The Polish state, even under Pilsudski, would nationalize traditionally Jewish economic niches like tobacco, for example, or alcohol. And so the Jewish population was under a lot of pressure economically. At the same time, if you had to choose between being somebody who had a small stall in the marketplace and was barely scraping by and a peasant, who is trying to live off agriculture on a tiny little plot of land and facing real starvation, you would probably prefer the situation of the Jews. So it's all very relative. There's a worldwide depression going on, and the Jewish community is experiencing real economic crisis, mass poverty, although there are very visible exceptions in the Jewish population, as we almost always have, right? Of Jews who have managed to figure it out and learn how to adjust to the current situation. And they are generous often, they give a lot of charity. And of course, you have American Jews who seem to be extremely well off and giving a lot of charity. It creates a perception of Jewish economic well-being, which fuels a lot of the resentment and the anti-Semitic, events, really.
Right. There are a lot of questions. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them, so I'm trying to pick the ones that may be unique or particularly interesting. One is that perhaps you mentioned it. Were you quoting from interviews that the Joint conducted among Polish Catholics to survey their attitudes towards Jews? What was the context and the motive?
They're trying to get a handle of things. This is happening, really uh, i- in the mid 1930s when things are very much heating up in terms of boycotts and picketing and pogroms. One of the things I forgot to mention, you might find interesting, is the anti-Jewish picketers, meaning those standing outside of stores and stalls, preventing Christians, holding signs and preventing Christians from buying. They were actually being paid in a lot of cases, a day's wage sometimes to stand out there and picket by the right-wing nationalist organizations, the NDEC or Stronice Narodowa organizations. So that's one thing I forgot to mention. But yeah, this was an attempt to figure out what's going on here. How much of this is really being sort of bought or accepted by the general Polish population, and how much is just extremists?
A logistical question, and then we'll do one more right after this. Are most of your pictures that you use from the JDC archives?
No, but some of them are.
Yeah.
And I guess I didn't always cite them. Sorry for that. But yeah, I did get a fair number from the JDC archives. There's a very rich photographic collection, but I really take photographs from wherever I can find them. The U.S. Holocaust Museum, the UVO archives, and Wikipedia turns out to be a very generous public domain source of a lot of these photographs too. So really all over the place. But yeah, in a few cases, JDC archives.
I'm going to ask one more question. We're a little over time, but I want to give one more because there are so many. The ones that we aren't answering now, I will be sharing with you, Glenn, and you can always respond to them later. To what extent did the attempt to restrict Poland to Catholic Poles affect non-Jewish ethnic groups? Was there violence against them? Is
So
that something you have?
you mean
Yeah.
other ethnic minorities?
Yes.
Right. It's very interesting. They don't seem to be physically attacked the way Jews are. And it's strange because Ukrainians actually want to overthrow the Polish government and create an autonomous Ukrainian state. Now, there are going to be Ukrainian historians who view this a couple years from now and say, this guy's crazy. I have in the archives attacks on Ukrainians, in this place and that place. And that may be the case. And that probably is the case, if I'm going to really guess. But I haven't seen anything coming close to something like a pogrom. It's just that Jews seem to activate a kind of physical, violent response among members of dominant populations, um, and other minorities, as we've seen today. You know, uh, more than other groups do, and Jews fighting back seems to enrage everybody much more so than when members of other groups do it. And just to end, I should just say, if you think physical self-defense is heroic and practical, okay, but just note that the responses in speeches and in the media to Jewish self-defense initiatives were the claim that Jews are raising an army and they're planning on taking over Poland and conquering Poland. That's the result of their fighting back. So they didn't go on social media and accuse Jews of genocide, but they do accuse them of trying to conquer Poland itself. So really violence, I guess, has a good conclusion. Violence is really a double-edged sword, and violence can go either way. Sometimes it's effective and sometimes it's not, which is why it's always, always really important to search for other nonviolent forms of resistance and especially alliances and try to be effective uh, in other ways and really, really viewing violence as kind of a last resort.
Which is one of the reasons why JDC has been around for so long and has been so helpful in most of these sort of educational and cultural endeavors, right? Which makes it particularly interesting. Okay, so really there are a lot of questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we're over time, and I want to be cognizant of other people's other responsibilities. Thank you. This was really interesting, Glenn. I'm glad we did this. I'm looking forward to the next round of research. Um, and I hope everybody here has found this interesting today, and thank you for joining us. I want to thank again the Miriam, Mimi, Pasternak, Toubin Public Educational Programming from the JDC Archives making this webinar possible. The next program in our series on exploring the Jewish experience in Poland from World War I to the Holocaust, Insights from the JDC Archives, will take place on January 13th. Elena Hoffenberg is recipient of the Nathan and Sarah Chesson JDC Archives Fellowship for 2024 and will give a lecture on family and credit in interwar Poland. Invitations will be sent out this week, and we hope that you'll be able to join us. Thank you, everybody, and please take care and stay safe. Thanks a lot, Glenn.